Welcome to the second lecture for Chapter 11 on interpersonal conflict. In the first lecture, we talked a little bit about what interpersonal conflict is. We looked at some of the characteristics of conflict. We talked about some of the benefits of conflict. And in this chapter, or this lecture, we're really going to be focusing on some common pitfalls for managing conflict, as well as some of the major ways in which we experience and manage conflict in interpersonal relationships, some good and some potentially harmful for relationships. So in the first lecture, we really talked about, if some of the benefits for interpersonal conflict, as well as some of the reasons why, conflict can be harmful for relationships. And so, one question that I get a lot is if conflicts are healthy for relationships, then why can some conflicts be so destructive? And I talked a little bit about in the first lecture, distinguishing between kind of just the presence of conflict and how conflicts are managed. And so when we think about potential reasons why conflicts can be destructive in relationships, oftentimes is because the conflict is not being managed properly. And so thinking about some of the common pitfalls to managing conflicts, I think perhaps the most common is this experience of hot emotions, having kind of a emotional, fast, reflexive way of responding to threat or stress that conflict can trigger. And so thinking about instead of having a logical or rational response or engaging in that discussion in a logical or rational way, sometimes our emotions, anger, frustration, can really hinder the way that we think and the way that we communicate about our opinions when engaging in conflict. Additionally, this can prevent us from engaging in perspective taking, productive problem solving, creating creative solutions. And so in these cases, sometimes having like a timeout or a cool off period can help better navigate that conflict down the road. So if you kind of feel one or both members feel kind of these hot emotions arising, take a time out, provide some time for reflection, and then come back to it when maybe the stress or the threat is not as fresh, and you can engage in that logical and rational discussion. We also know that during conflict, we don't always see things very clearly or very rationally. And this could be because we are clouded by our biased perceptions or erroneous ways of thinking about situations that can kind of make it worse. Your chapter talked about several different biased perceptions that we can have in managing conflict. I've put them into a graph here. And so the first is that we sometimes can oversimplify the situation. So people involved in the conflict can drastically oversimplify kind of what's going on, perhaps relying on things like stereotypes or blaming the other person, ignoring potentially contradictory information or information that doesn't align with your own opinion. And you can see how this would really dramatically impact how people respond to messaging and how it can lead a conflict in a potentially negative direction. The second is exaggerating differences. So it's almost kind of the opposite of the first one. So thinking about, really exaggerating the difference between the two viewpoints. I said earlier in the first lecture that when we think about conflict, we're thinking about perceptions of scarce resources and perceptions of incompatible goals. And here in this second bias perception, those perceptions are really exaggerating how differently we think about things, me and my partner, when in reality we might be actually closer to wanting the same goal or to being able to achieve the resources that we need than kind of we initially think. And so this could be another kind of biased way that we approach conflict. Somewhat related to oversimplifying the situation is viewing conflict as a win-lose proposition. So sometimes we see this as like, well, you can have this or this, but really there are a lot of in between options that could exist. And so thinking about kind of having more kind of collaborative ways at looking at conflict resolution to see if we could maybe compromise, or we could come up with a win-win situation in which both members are really happy, as opposed to thinking about conflict resolution as a situation where one person's going to win and get the resources or achieve their goals and the other person is not. Because we know that in conflict resolution, oftentimes we can come to some sort of compromise and some sort of situation where there isn't a clear, a clearly defined winner and a clearly defined loser in that conflict. Not to say that this doesn't exist. Sometimes there are conflicts where there is a winner and a loser, but really thinking about not viewing the conflict like that, kind of erroneously, or not biasing the conflict as to being a win-lose proposition when it actually is not. The fourth bias perception is making self-serving judgments. So people naturally are kind of aware of their own needs and motivations more than they are of others. And we kind of naturally see things from our own perspective. And this can serve in how we view the conflict and how we make judgments about the resources or about the goals. And so, really just trying not to focus solely on kind of your own perspective, but really avoiding this bias perception by really trying to see things from the other person's point of view. The fifth is falsely assuming understanding. This is both falsely assuming that you understand what the other person is saying, as well as falsely assuming that the other person understands what you are saying. And so when we kind of think about things like meaning making and encoding and decoding and feedback and noise, you think about the whole chapter on interpretation. We know that our messages aren't always interpreted the way that we want them to. And so in a conflict situation, when we falsely assume that people, that we are being clear or that we understand what other people are saying without kind of checking in and maybe paraphrasing what they say and making sure that you have the correct understanding, then this provides kind of a false sense of transparency, which can really escalate conflicts. The last bias perception is undervaluing the other person's proposals for conflict resolution. So thinking about maybe conflict in a way like if the other person is getting what they want, then they must be, then you maybe aren't getting, or you're getting the raw end of the deal, or you're not happy if other people are happy. So maybe, even in potential conflicts resolution or negotiation interactions, potentially just, putting down the other person's ideas without really thinking about them could also fall into this bias perception. So we know that, talking about the two common pitfalls to managing conflict, hot emotions, bias perceptions, and then finally communication obstacles. So when emotions are high, when we are experiencing a hot emotion, when we have these bias perception, we know that our communication can suffer. And there are some specific communication obstacles that we can experience. The first is that during conflict, when our emotions are high, maybe we aren't seeing things from multiple perspectives because we're focused in those biased perceptions, we can sometimes say the wrong things. And so often communication during conflict focuses on solutions before fully understanding the problem. We can offer premature solutions. We maybe avoid conflict by signaling that it's not a big deal. And so really thinking about potentially talking about the wrong things or saying the wrong things. So thinking about the second one, people often talk in incorrect ways. So sometimes we can make conflicts worse by kitchen sinking or gunny sacking, which your chapter talked about, potentially bringing up irrelevant points or past grievances. We'll talk in a moment about Gottman's 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And so this would include things like, right here, yes, talking in ways that present criticism or contempt, or defensiveness or stonewalling. So really thinking about the Gottman's 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse as specific ways of engaging in conflict that are problematic. And we sometimes fall into these traps. We can even think about them as potential traps. Some of this relates back to that positive communication climate information that we talked about in the language chapter. But criticism essentially involves complaints about the other person's personality or characteristics, as opposed to really focusing on the behavior at hand that maybe you're having a contention about, and so thinking about more personal attacks that can flame conflict, as opposed to really focusing on the specific behavior, the specific issues at hand. All of those things would fall into criticism, and can be really problematic for relationships if happening often in a relationship as well as in conflict resolution. We also know that contempt or insults that attack the other person's self-worth, name-calling, sarcasm, mocking the other person, really inappropriate ways of communicating with somebody that you're in a relationship with. But compound that with the conflict interaction, and this can be really problematic, and this can really inflame and escalate a conflict when we engage in contempt. When we experience criticism and contempt in our relationships, then we also sometimes have the response of being defensive, so guarding ourselves against criticism, maybe even being defensive when we aren't, when the message isn't really contempt or criticism, because maybe we've experienced that in the past. But defensiveness can also involve casting yourself kind of as a victim or blame or denying responsibility in the conflict. And so we can see how that could also trigger, an escalating response to a conflict situation. And stonewalling occurs when conflict really isn't resolved over long periods of time. This is kind of like avoiding the conflict situation. Really, when we withhold conversation, we withhold interaction. We know that this is kind of like avoiding the conflict altogether. But specifically when people say that they really want to engage in conflict, and you kind of avoid that interaction. So almost like a demand withdrawal, like somebody's trying to negotiate or engage in conflict resolution and you pull back. We can engage in stonewalling if we in previous interactions have experienced criticism, contempt, and defensiveness from our partner. Sometimes it's just stonewalling is a natural response, almost like self-preservation. So the last thing that your chapter talked about is some of the 5 important strategies for managing conflict in relationships. So these are specific conflict resolution strategies. Some of these, or all of these, you may have heard of before. So compromising, competing, collaborating, avoiding, and accommodating. And when we think about these strategies, we know that much like some of the other things that we've talked about in this class, each of these strategies is representative of 2 important dimensions. So the first dimension is kind of your concern for yourself and you're achieving your own goals. So we see that on the left-hand side, as well as your concern for the other person in the relationship. And so we can have a low concern for self, or a high concern for self, or a low concern for others and a high concern for others. And the interaction of these 2 dimensions really represent these 5 strategies for managing conflict. So let's start with situations when we have a high concern for achieving our own goals, and maybe we aren't as concerned with the other person achieving the goals or getting the resources that are available to them. This is a representative of a conflict that really maybe represent a strategy that could be used when a win-lose situation is truly represented in a conflict situation. And so thinking about the goal of this conflict resolution strategy is to win the conflict, to get the resources, to achieve your goals. And This may be appropriate in situations where there is a concrete outcome that cannot be shared. So thinking about, if you and your friend are competing for a job, or you're competing for like a grant or something, one person's going to get it and one person's not. And so thinking about engaging in this strategy, because it is a truly win-lose situation, you may work towards resolving the conflict so that you get the job or that you get the resources, and the other person does not. And that really does represent this high concern for self and low concern for the other person. If we go down, thinking about the kind of opposite of that is a low concern for self and low concern for others would lead to ignoring conflict, and hoping that it will go away. So this really avoiding behavior that we've talked about before. So avoiding is failing to engage in the conflict. Oftentimes, when this leads to unresolved conflicts, it can be bad. This can be a really problematic strategy. But there are times, like when I said earlier, when we are experiencing hot emotions, that maybe avoiding it for a very short period of time could be positive because it's used to maintain harmony until maybe both people are ready to engage in that conflict. So almost like avoiding on a very short timeline can be okay, but if we're avoiding over longer periods of time and the conflict is going unresolved, it can really make the situation and the conflict worse. Going to the right, and looking at accommodating, which represents a strategy that has low concern for yourself and achieving your goals and a high concern for other people to achieve their goals. And this strategy really is representative of sacrifice. So kind of sacrificing your own achievement so that the other person can win. Sometimes we do this just to keep the peace in our relationships. And again, this strategy may work short term, but over long periods of time, it can really lead to resentment if this is used frequently in the same relationship over a period of time. The top strategy is often revered as the probably most positive or beneficial strategy, but it is one that takes the most work. And so thinking about collaborating as having a high concern for self and a high concern for others. And collaborating involves engaging in the negotiation process that where we're working to make the situation a win-win situation. So really working to maximize the gains for both individuals in the conflict. Again, this requires a great deal of energy and time and imagination and patience. And so we can see that even though this is a really beneficial and an outcome, a management strategy that can have a really positive outcome, we can see why maybe we would default to some of these other strategies like compromising, because it's so effortful. And so compromising, unlike collaborating, when we're working to kind of create a out of the box solution where we have a win-win situation to a conflict. Compromising thinks about everyone's needs and requires both parties to give something up in order to resolve the conflict. So, you're not giving everything away. You might be getting a little bit of what you want, but you're not getting all of what you want like you would in collaborating. And same with the other person. So the other person gets a little bit, but not all of what they want. This also takes a little bit of time and patience to do it correctly, but it can have a fairly positive outcome. And I put this one in the middle because it's the strategy that represents kind of a moderate concern for both yourself and the other person. So really thinking about giving something up in order for both people to be happy. So both people giving in a little bit to achieve kind of that harmony in their relationship.